Lone Rider here, and I want to talk about what I'll call soft censorship. That would be the use of techniques to suppress people's views, or discourage people from expressing their views that don't rise to the level of actual censorship, with the capital C. Censorship, of course, by definition, is the use of coercion by the government to outlaw dissent or to suppress dissent. Or to suppress expression, generally speaking. And of course, private people can't really censor. They can intimidate, they can, bully, but they can't really censor. Only the government can censor with a capital C. However, there's a growing trend that, I would describe as soft censorship with a lowercase c. And that would be these things that don't rise to the level of actual censorship, but are intended to suppress people's views. This would be like kicking people off social media, putting disclaimers or demonetizing YouTube videos, boycotts, things like that. And we're seeing an increasing amount of this, especially in terms of computers and social media. Now, what's alarming about that is that an increasing amount of our public discourse is taking place in a digital world, essentially. And I don't necessarily think that it's some kind of conspiracy in terms of, all these tech companies decided to get us to move our political discussions onto their platforms so that they could then control them. I don't think that was necessarily done on purpose. I think that might be giving them a little too much credit. But I do think that they looked around and realized that they basically had maybe not a legal monopoly in the technical sense of the term, but practically speaking, a near monopoly on these discussions. And certainly I think they decided to put their own imprimatur and their own stamp on it. And the problem with that, normally you would just say, well, these are private companies. They can do whatever the hell they want. The problem is so much of our public discourse is taking place not across the counter from people at the diner or the cafe or, in the actual real-life public square, but so much of it is taking place in the digital world that restrictions on that, even though they may not technically be censorship, are as destructive as censorship in the real world would be, because so much of the discussion is taking place there. And, people could say, well, it's good intention. We're just trying to prevent, hate speech and this and that. And kind of a nebulous term, though, right? I mean, one man's hate speech is another person's dissent. There are some things that I think we can all agree are vile and bigoted and disgusting and that nobody wants. But the point is, how short is the line from we don't want a person posting something that is legitimately hateful to we're going to take any political view we don't like, label it hate speech, and use that to suppress dissent or to steer the discussion, as it were. You can't, if these things weren't platforms where so much political discourse is taking place and so many discussions of issues of the day, it'd be no big deal, right? But because these things are equally as important as the real life public square, in fact, one might argue more so for many people, the suppression of views there, or the regulation of views, as it were, becomes an issue, right? When this is your main go-to, rather than writing a letter to the editor in the newspaper or holding a rally in the town square or going to a public meeting, when your main forum of political discourse is online discussion, then regulation of views on that platform becomes tantamount to actual censorship, even though it's not. Because that is the new public square. And so I would argue that if we can call it, again, soft censorship, quote unquote, is not technically censorship in terms of the government, forbidding speech, but it is approaching the level of danger of actual, censorship, because so much political discussion occurs under the rubric of it, under the auspices of these entities, which as private entities, aren't restrained by the First Amendment, let's say. Right? They can do things that the government couldn't. And, if you want to restrict somebody's right to speak in the real non-digital world, you need the government to do it, right? Some internet company can have or Facebook or whatever can have all the rules they want. It's not going to affect what somebody can say in their own home, standing on the street corner, when they attend a public meeting, when they're writing something or sending a letter or whatever. But when in the real world, that person's method of discourse is largely through an internet forum or fora, the rules of those fora then become, they have more of an impact akin to actual censorship, right? So, this normally silly, vague, possibly biased rules about speech, you could just sort of shake your head and laugh and chuckle and say, "Oh, what a bunch of maroons," But there's nothing to chuckle about when a large percentage of public discourse is taking place under those rules. All of a sudden, that may not be censorship, but it's potentially as destructive as actual censorship. And I think our understanding of what censorship is has to maybe broaden to take into account the impact of the fact that so much of our public discourse is no longer taking place standing on a street corner or in person at a public meeting, but is taking place in the virtual world where, a terms and conditions policy reviewer has as much power as a government censor in the real world. So anyway, that's my take on what I'll call soft censorship, and I do believe it is a problem, and I do believe we need to think about it seriously. Lone Rider out.